Counterfeit Interlude. In between my adventure at the House of Fishstick and my exciting time among the people of the Tangerine Vale, I took some time off and paid a visit to one of my favorite stores, or shops as you call them in Great Britain. Trade a treasure. Its subterranean location makes it particularly cozy, and the fact that it is staffed by a rotating group of feeble old ladies makes it especially easy to shoplift from. Even if I'm not in the mood to steal, it's still a fun place to poke around in. Besides, most of the really interesting stuff is too large to fit under my coat. On the day under review, rain was coming down from the sky in the gentle but constant flow that made the prospect of visiting the quiet, warm store all the more delightful. I nodded at the old lady behind the counter, but she, with a worried expression, busied herself with a stack of old books. As usual, barely audible music was coming from somewhere, but I could never discover its source. I made my way through the maze of rooms to one of my favorites, the room where the sculpture was displayed. While examining a hideous collection of Netsuke and incidentally debating whether I should bother stuffing one up my sleeve, I heard the sound of voices from the next room. With awareness born of more than one encounter with Mr. Policeman, I investigated. A screen had been set up in this room some time ago. Behind it, a young woman with what I believed to be some kind of interpersonal disorder sat every day painting tiny canvases of flowers. I had learned to avoid her, to avoid interesting myself in her work. All previous efforts had been irritably rebuffed. Yet today a man was behind the screen with her. They were talking, softly it was true, but rather animatedly. I looked about at the framed examples of the woman's work, listening all the while. Her work, by the way, was poor, yet I admired her devotion to its production. "It should be a simple matter for you," the man said. "I told you I'm not interested," the woman replied. "Not interested in making money?" The man couldn't believe it. "But you mean making money literally," she protested. "Shh," the man cautioned. "I think the shoplifter is eavesdropping." A $10 bill is hidden in book. A $10 bill is hidden in a book on the 6th floor. Having defeated the witch doctor's schemes and hopefully taught the people of the Tangerine Vale that true happiness lies in the option of reason and science, I turned my attention to the rumors that MRZT, a local radio station, had been promulgating of late. "Are you the guy that's been talking about the $10 bill in the library book?" I asked a bearded scoundrel in the hallway of the station. "No, man, that's Dave Higgins," the man pointed. "He's in the broadcaster's little room thing right now." I nodded, no smile for him. This was serious business and required that a serious demeanor be displayed. I started down the hall. "But hey, man, you can't go in there right now. Dave's on the air," the bearded fellow called after me. I dismissed his concerns as easily as I flashed my official identification and continued with my mission. The shag carpeting and wood paneling that line the narrow hallway, as well as the vaguely psychedelic posters that line those paneled walls, convinced me, if nothing yet had, that this truly was a radio station in the early 1970s. I considered just how much more purchasing power a $10 bill had in the current time period. Perhaps some slothful part of my persona suggested it would be better to let things go. After all, this traitorous part continued. With the passage of years, the bill would become less valuable, and the impetus to retrieve it would thereby lessen. Your precious library of books in their hard-maintained order will be preserved. "But what about this?" I countered, pulling out a memorandum I had heretofore kept everyone, myself included, ignorant of. "Rare $10 bill contains flaw in Alexander Hamilton's portrait. Makes famous Treasury Secretary appear to be a demon from creature. Makes famous Treasury Secretary appear to be a demon creature from Titan," I read aloud. "Oh, man," Dave Higgins, a bearded scoundrel like his colleague, replied. "That's not a flaw. That bill's counterfeit." "Your reasoning is as poisonous as the air in this little room," I dared him to answer that quite as readily. "There's nothing to worry about, man. Want a hit?" He offered me some of his marijuana, and that slothful part of me accepted. Crust bracket intends no harm. I may have been too busy eating to notice it, but according to reports that later reached these mockery-inducing ears of mine, the television program that had been playing in the dining room hall was a fictional account of the life of Rectanglo, just as Rectanglo's adventures are semi-fictional extrapolations of my own. My response to these reports, an observation that this was like an American version of a British program that is in turn remade as another British program, was greeted with good humor, but no real attention. I angrily sent them all away and hid under my desk, pretending it was a space capsule. Crustbracket, the titular character of the program, was, like Rectangulo, an outsized personality whose adventures bordered on the surreal. He, too, lived in a world inside a box floating in space, but unlike Rectangulo, was not the superpowered overlord of that world. Apparently, the producers felt that giving Crustbracket so much power made it too easy for him to achieve victory over the forces ranged against him each week. I may disagree, but I am contractually forbidden to make my views public. In the episode that I missed while eating my collard greens and beets, Crustbracket is asked to infiltrate the temple of the cornered god, Bifturek, as a favor for an old lady. "I think my cat's in there," the old lady explained in a cracked and warbling voice. She and Crustbracket stood on the opposite side of the street from the less than forbidding, but all the more daunting for being so, temple, a simple box-like structure crowned with a fiberglass statue of Bifturek. "I'm not going to hurt anybody if I can help it," Crustbracket announced, drawing gloves of yellow deer hide over his hands. "But I'll get your cat out one way or another." "Don't hurt my cat either, please," the old lady begged. "Don't try to restrict my actions," Crustbracket retorted as he stepped off the curb. Evidently this was intended as a snappy line, for this is where the program paused for a commercial. "Hello, friends." The actor who played Rectangular smiled at the camera amid a scene of household disarray. "Do you have trouble balancing your aesthetic yearnings with the demands of your family?" The Malgenefic beams dry fast. It was at Porger's birthday party that the question was first put to me. "Do Malgenefic beams dry fast?" Ms. Dalfrip asked, forking a tiny nibble of the piece of birthday cake she held. "Well," I answered knowledgeably, "if by fast you mean quickly, then I would say yes, they do." "And what if I meant some other use of the word fast?" Miss Dalfrip suggested, simpering and squinting with what I'm sure she felt was a charming and flirtatious echo of adolescence. "Then, Miss Dalfrip," I maintained my lordly mien, and isn't that the best kind of mien, as I prepared to make my departure from the woman's presence, "I should, in any case, beg you to excuse me. I see that it's my turn on the bandstand." Whatever sour looks the woman lobbed at my back were of no concern to me. I had a performance to give. Still, even as I strapped my horn around my neck, I couldn't help wondering about the Malgenefic beams and how fast they dried. Damn, Miss Dalfrip! I had heard she would mess with one's mind, and now I knew it for sure. My first notes betrayed my agitated state. We were supposed to be playing a tender ballad, one I've played before, called Mean Granny Lisa and the Two-Crowned Prong, but my restless, aggressive solos were at odds with the song's intended emotional burden. "God, you suck," a bearded youth commented as I stepped down from the riser. "That was really funny," a girl nearby added, whether in reference to my performance or the boy's comment, I could not say. "Just get out," Porter demanded, revealing himself to be joking seconds later with a wide grin and a heartfelt wish that he would see me again next year. "Malgenefic beams don't dry at all," Dr. Kerper explained to me on the ride home. His beard was bedizened with confetti, and it was all I could do to pay attention to him. "That's a misconception. Their initial application occurs in what is actually a gelatinous state." "Tell me, Doc," I asked, looking out the window of the helicoid conveyance, "why am I fascinated with scientists? Is it just the lab coats?" Normal working conditions imply headache and rain. Dr. Outre, in his capacity as scientific advisor to the debutante of Debris, was not supposed to take inspiration from the early albums of Frank Zappa, neither the music they contained nor the aesthetic expressed by their covers. Yet he did. He tried to keep this fact a secret, as he did the dual nature of his loyalties and the espionage work for Senor Gravitas that resulted thereof, but one could hardly fail to notice either the framed photo of Gravitas that hung on the wall over his desk or the bizarrely grouped accumulations of odds and ends that filled the rest of his office. "What is that noise?" Ben Dubendurado asked, putting his head in the door of Outre's office one day in the dead of winter. Outre looked up from a memorandum he was in the middle of composing. Its intended primary recipient was the debutante, though naturally a copy would be forwarded to Senor Gravitas. Its subject was the proper way to dress when the debutante should meet with the portmanteau of pajama. Its subject was the proper way to dress when the debutante should meet with the portmanteau of Pajama Mandible next week. I recorded a man reading a newspaper to a group of cigar rollers and overlaid it with the sounds of donuts falling off a conveyor belt and that of shoes being cobbled in the traditional manner by a man with no thumbs, Dr. Outre explained. I found it to be an intriguing combination. And you like listening to it? Ben was confused. You're sitting there listening to it on purpose? Sure. I made a whole album of it. When he heard this, Ben's eyebrows relaxed. He smiled faintly. Oh, I see, he said, nodding. See what? Outre asked. Ben sighed. You ever see those comic strips done by people who actually can't draw, so they take clip art and recurring images and make a comic strip out of it? He asked. I think I know what you mean, Outre answered hesitantly. Well, there you go. Outre frowned at his coworker. Thank you for stopping by, Ben. I'll see you at the surrender. Troubling expressions of horticulture. Big Bison, under the direction of the Sloan Ramble-Damble, a wheeled helicoid venture, positioned themselves not adjacent to the coupon dispenser as they had on previous forays into the arena, but against it. Risky strategy, isn't it? Capose, straw man to the Federation's seemingly endless moralizing, sniffed to his label mate, Francis Ajumjo. On the contrary, it's merely good manners. The other fellow, who was well acquainted with both Big Bison and Little Lambs, drummed his fingers on his belly. He inclined his laurel-crowned head towards Capose. Man's inexorable craving for variety, don't you know? He held one hand aloft and rubbed its fingers together in a vague pantomime of the interaction of a multitude of forces. If you say so, Francis, Capose decided to settle back and let things unfold as they would. On the opposite side of the arena, in plain view of Capose, Ajumjo, and the hundreds of other prospective buyers, although attracting far less attention than the Big Bison now donning hats and taking up walking sticks, stood a dozen enormous cacti, each in its own mobile stone crock. These cacti, equipped with eyes of inverted osmium, and gifted with powers of reflection and speech, were the nominal judges of all that passed for performance within the arena. Yet since their judgments would only be made known in the pages of the January issue of Willful Fishment, and would have little result other than the awarding of the annual Heimlich Knudsen Transpirational Medal, they were, as I said, largely ignored. One person who did not ignore them, however, was Abel Cardsharp, gardener to the stars. This nervous little man, dressed in a sweatshirt emblazoned with the image of a little lamb, fretted constantly with the moisturizing units attached to each cacti's crock. I was there with him in the role of friend and confidant, however dubious and dismissive I may have sounded. Why do they even need these units, Abel? I asked. I thought cacti could do without water for long periods of time. Abel only shook his head and cowered in the shadows of his charges, prompting me to abandon him for the concession stand. I doubted he could introduce me to David Letterman anyway. Faceless fate rent by the pentagram. As powerful a symbol as the pentagram supposedly is, it is nothing compared to the Bactrium of procurement. The latter, an elongated oval divided into three segments by two lines that extend beyond the oval's parameters and crowned with a heavy dot in the upper segment, has been known to provoke stern letters to the editor in the local public organ when seen branded into the hides of dairy cattle. As for the pentagram, outside of frightening congressmen into drafting repressive legislation that will never be enforced, much less passed, what has it ever really accomplished? Still, I suppose we must discuss it, as it is in the title of this piece for all the world to see. Before we get started, I said to Broomwillow, wouldn't you rather discuss the Bactrium than the pentagram? The Bactrium? What's that? He asked. What a joker Broomwillow can be. You wouldn't know it to look at him, all sober and severe in his brown sack suit. The symbol for procurement, I reminded him indulgently. Procurement? The look on his face was disconcerting. Loathe procurement? I gave the philosophy its full name, hoping he hadn't forgotten so soon. Loathe? Oh, your belief system. Yes, I remember now. Good, I smiled. Now, wouldn't you rather discuss the Bactrium than the pentagram? I repeated, enunciating the words with care. Oh, sure, but as you pointed out, we're here to discuss the pentagram. Broomwillow nodded soberly and spread his arms out in resignation. Are you resigned to your fate? I jumped at the chance to kill two birds, one stone. Broomwillow's look of confusion returned. Never mind, I said. Now, the pentagram. Would you agree that being drawn in the Middle Ages, it should be considered public domain? You mean the actual sigil of Baphomet with the goat's head in Hebrew letters? Yes. Yes, I think so. Good, I sighed. I'm glad we agree. We sounded the bellmaker's devotion to Aardvark. I decided to stick with Broomwillow for a while. We drew variants of the Bactrium, a rectangle instead of an oval, otherwise the same, on each other's foreheads and began beating on makeshift drums as we marched up the street. "You there!" An old man in the floppy pointed cap of a cobbler bellowed at us. "You that bear the mark of procurement, what are you doing making all that racket?" "We are sounding the bellmaker's devotion to Aardvark, cobbler," I answered politely but loudly so that all might hear. "Old Grufweda?" the cobbler replied, standing up from his makeshift chair and peering down the street at the bellmaker's sign. "Devoted to Aardvark? Are you sure?" "These are not mendacious fellows, Mr. Shoemaker," a pedestrian in robes of sumptuous ermine declared. "I do not think they try to deceive us." "I make no reference to deceit, Vendor Stevens," the old cobbler snapped. "I merely said that these two, being but young men," here he gestured to Broomwillow and me with an iron implement used for pulling the tongues from shoes, "are likely to be mistaken about such an imputation." "Young men," I repeated with derision. "I don't know about Broomwillow here, but I am hardly a young man." "I'm 31, Broomwillow added, unnecessarily, as we will see, for he disappears from our story right now. I turned to ask, rhetorically, of course, whether Broomwillow considered me to be young, but he had already disappeared. So I merely turned about on the sidewalk, silently imploring passers-by to judge for themselves whether mine was the face of a young man. In vain did the cobbler and subsequently the vendor try to explain that, relatively speaking, I was a young man. I was young in comparison to them, in other words, but I would have none of it. I was a budding phoebe, and I could prove it. I turned back the way I had come, back towards the bellmakers. "Bellmaker Grufweda!" I bellowed, throwing open his door with a crash. "What the hell are you doing here?" the bellmaker demanded, looking up from a wax model of his latest design. "You're old enough to know better than that." Quite a dapper little fellow. Mr. Throbdobble, quite a dapper little fellow indeed, entered Mr. Grosvenor's haberdashery fresh from the barber shop. His recently shaved face smelled of Fullerton's No. 6, and his hair, neatly cut and sleeked down, smelled of Stimson's finishing oil. The combination of these two scents, together with the reek of money that emanated from every detail of Mr. Throbdobble's attire, acted upon Mr. Grosvenor's system in much the same way catnip does on most cats. I had a cat once that made no sign whatsoever of recognition when exposed to catnip, so, according to my reasoning, there must be haberdashers out there that are indifferent to the sight of a healthy man with an appreciation for the traditional viewpoint in men's clothing. But Mr. Grosvenor was not one of these. "Good morning," Mr. Grosvenor greeted Mr. Throbdobble. "Good morning, My name is Throbdobble, Cyrus Throbdobble," returned the customer. "Pleased to meet you, sir. I am Julius Grosvenor." The two men shook hands, the shop owner in black, the customer in gray. "And this is your establishment?" Throbdobble asked, gesturing about at the old-fashioned sales floor with a stamped tin ceiling. "Yes, it is." "Very good. I was hoping I could speak to the owner and not just a salesman." Mr. Throbdobble's mustache wriggled expressively. "I have just arrived in this city after many months at sea. I am taking up residence here, and I will require a full complement of items to make my stay as comfortable and elegant as possible." These words were to Mr. Grosvenor as delightful as the sound of Mick Jagger's voice on the telephone would be to a person wishing that famous singer to buy a number of paintings from him. Of course, I have been hard at work producing paintings that might appeal to any number of celebrities, all without compromising my personal vision, but the longed-for telephone call does not come. Sometimes it's night in my studio as I play the guitar in between layers of paint. I have the fantasy that Eddie Van Halen, whose car has broken down on the road outside, will come into my yard looking for assistance and hear my playing. Intrigued, he will knock on my studio door. I'll invite him in, and he'll discover that I'm not just a great guitar player, but a painter of irresistible canvases. As amusing as the prosthetic device upon which he leant. Only the Munch Monster could find something humorous about the sight of the artificial limbs attached to Gruffin's torso. The song accompanying the scene promised ultimate vengeance on those who belittle human dignity, but I didn't believe James Taylor could fulfill that promise, not against the Munch Monster. Anyway, I had settled myself against laughing before I entered the chamber, knowing that my reactions would be monitored. No effort on my part was necessary, however. The show wasn't funny. "He's not laughing," one of the researchers commented. "What is he doing?" the blonde automaton asked. "He appears to be making a sour look." The blonde consulted his chart. "I don't have a box to check with that appellation." "Oh, hell, just check religious objection," another researcher, one busying himself inflating several children with helium, growled from across the room. "Nobody reads these reports anyway." "I resent that. Programming wouldn't know what to put on the air without thorough documentation of feedback from the target demographic." "I think there's been some mistake," I said, entering the data collection room. "I'm not in the target demographic." "How'd you get through that door?" Blondie demanded. "That's 19-weight duodenium." You're between the ages of 25 and 40, aren't you? The first researcher asked. White, little to no college, raised by fundamentalist ignoramuses. Yes, but this program just isn't the kind of thing that I would watch if I had a TV, which I don't, I explained. The researcher stared at the automaton, awestruck. One of the children floated up to the ceiling. He doesn't have a TV, one said in horror. Amputate his legs, the blonde ordered. Make him feel identification with the character. As they readied me for the surgery, one of them asked me cynically what kind of program would be the kind I like to watch. I don't know, I mused. A quiet, slow-paced cartoon, maybe?